All right, here we go. Chapter 10 from Summer with the Marine. Chapter 10, Ford. I'll just wait 1 minute. I feel like some of you might be joining me. Okay. The days away had been tough. With Ford's new responsibilities, he had transitioned to the reserves in the Marines, but he still had a few items to square away, sending him to Lejeune for the week. Plus, he had a meeting with the lawyers to finalize some items with his inheritance and the custody of Coco. When he got home, he was thrilled to see his little girl light up when she recognized his face. He gave her a big hug and presented a teddy bear dressed in a uniform that matched the one he'd worn during the ceremony honoring some of his fellow Marines, which he'd also attended while away. After dinner, father and daughter took a walk on the beach. Thunder cracked in the distance and Coco jumped with fright. He took her in his arms and told her a story about how God sure enjoyed a good game of bowling. It was the same story he remembered his father told him before everything had changed. It was likely his earliest memory. Ford's voice seemed to soothe his daughter, but they returned to the house, safe from the incoming weather. After getting Coco settled in and reading her a story, he clicked off the light and said, "I love you, Coco Bear." The nickname had come to him as easily as telling her he loved her, kissing her boo-boos and even getting on the floor and playing with blocks and her other toys. He wasn't sure how he'd adapt to fatherhood. So far he was managing, plus his recent windfall afforded him the ability to hire help. But it was all so new, and he still had a ways to go as he found his footing. After letting the nanny know he was going to step out, but that he'd be back in under an hour in case Coco woke up from the thunder, he took his jeep across town. The wind had picked up and the palm fronds jittered and rustled above. It was his first tropical storm in Blue Bay Beach, but he'd been through others elsewhere and wanted to make sure Eisley and her mother had everything they needed. Also, he wanted an excuse to see her. He'd confessed his love. They'd kissed. The memory filled him with warmth and anticipation of doing it again. His skin hummed as he cruised through the sleepy town well after sunset. He envisioned a future with Eisley, but first he had to figure out a way to tell her about Coco and his inheritance. The light from the television flashed through the window as he knocked on the door of 4 Pelican Lane. Mrs. Higgins opened the door, greeting him with excitement. "You know, you never used to knock. Come right in, Ford." "Well, I'm not a punk teenager anymore," he joked. "I've learned some manners, ma'am." She looked him up and down. "No, you certainly are not a punk teenager, and no need to call me ma'am. Makes me feel old." She giggled. Eisley entered from the kitchen wearing an apron. Her eyes didn't sparkle. In fact, a frown drew her lips down. He thought she'd be happy to see him, at least as happy as Mrs. Higgins was. "I got back earlier today," he said. "Thought I'd say hi and check on you ladies. Make sure you're ready for the storm." If he wasn't mistaken, Eisley scowled. The forecasters have us on a hurricane watch, and they're predicting they'll upgrade it to a warning overnight." Mrs. Higgins watched the television intently. "Well, you ought to batten down the hatches, close the storm shutters and such," he suggested. "We got supplies today," Mrs. Higgins said. "Did you take everything in from outside? Anything that could blow through a window?" he asked. "Yep," Eisley responded curtly. "Mavis told me that 3 years ago a car somehow ended up on the roof of one of the mansions on the way into town." Mrs. Higgins shook her head. "Maybe they'll wash away in the storm," Eisley muttered. Ford's brow furrowed. "What do you have against the mansions?" Mrs. Higgins asked. Without waiting for her daughter's reply, she said, "Back when we were in Jersey, I used to think I'd like to live in a house like that." "House?" Eisley said sharply. "House, mansion, whatever. But can you imagine having to keep up with the housework? It would take a week to get it done, and by then you'd have to start all over." Mrs. Higgins chuckled. Excuse me. "Mom, I'm pretty sure the residents of those mansions hire housekeepers." She caught a glare at Ford, "and I'm pretty sure the residents of those kinds of places aren't exactly honest." But she said the last part low as though only intended for Ford to hear. No matter, it flew over Mrs. Higgins' head as a meteorologist warned viewers about the dangers of storms and precautions to take afterward. When Ford and Eisley had professed their love, surely she didn't think he'd expect her to cook and clean for him or act as a housekeeper. Was that what was upsetting her? If anything, he wanted to do that for her. While he was gone, he'd had plenty of time to think about the future and his new fortune. He decided that he would do whatever he could to provide for Coco and Eisley. He'd be able to send his daughter to college and fix whatever financial trouble Eisley found herself in. Whatever had sent her to live with her mother again. He certainly wasn't overly interested in using the money for himself. He could help veterans, families caught in natural disasters, and even provide for his grandkids and great-grandkids. Lost in his thoughts, Mrs. Higgins' voice brought him back to the present. "With the storm coming in, you're welcome to stay here, Ford," she offered. "I'm sure he has plenty of space and doesn't need to be in this cramped little beach shack," Eisley said. "Eisley, I'm very proud of this cottage. I thought you liked it too." Mrs. Higgins' expression creased. Her daughter rolled her eyes. Maybe they'd been arguing before he'd arrived. "The couch is a bit on the small side for you, but it's better than being out in the storm," Mrs. Higgins said. Did she think he and his daughter, assuming she knew about Coco, lived in his Jeep? It dawned on him that Eisley didn't know where he lived because he hadn't told her, because he was scared, because beneath all his brawn there were parts of him that were still a little boy. Without so much as another word, Eisley returned to the kitchen. "It's awfully kind of you, but I should probably get going." Ford tipped his chin in goodbye, figuring they needed some space. Mrs. Higgins leaned close to him. "All week she's been on cloud nine, and then this afternoon she's been in quite the mood. I told her not to make more ice cream in case the power goes out, but she won't stop. She's been at it for hours, mixing up batches of bittersweet chocolate, banana mint curry or something." She wrinkled her nose. "I told her I'm not testing that flavor." A deep furrow formed across Ford's brow. "I think it's this weather. She's not used to the pressure changes. Let it blow over and she'll probably be as good as new. Then she'll wonder what the heck she was concocting in there." With a glance at Eisley's back and with Mrs. Higgins' chuckle, Ford swept into the night. The wind picked up even more and jostled the Jeep as he returned to the sprawling stucco mega-mansion with alcoves, balconies, and even a turret. As he entered through the double front door, he realized he should have invited them to his place. It was fortified for storms and probably more comfortable. But he sensed Eisley's disdain, so maybe it was better to wait to tell her until after things blew over. He turned on the news to track the storm, and sure enough, the wind started to howl. Rain pelted the windows, and he kept an ear out for Coco in case it woke her up. Meteorologists predicted the worst of the storm was south of them, but they'd still have damaging wind and rain. Ford started to doze when a loud banging came from somewhere in the house. He woke with a start and adrenaline rushed through him. His mind put him on alert and his body went into fight mode. He listened, and the banging was more of a knocking sound. He told himself he wasn't under attack. The baby monitor screen showed that Coco was fast asleep. The knocking came from the front door. Even though he wasn't in enemy territory, he braced himself as he answered. To his surprise, Eisley stood there, sopping wet. Her hair hung to her shoulders and her eye makeup was smudged, but the scowl she wore suggested it wasn't because of the weather. "Hi?" he said, uncertain, and stepped back to let her in. Her hands flew to her hips as she looked around. "Up until earlier today, I toyed with the idea of us, you and me, of staying in Blue Bay Beach, but at the rate I'm going in life, I may as soon have to apply for a second job as a maid. Are you hiring? Or should I ask your secret girlfriend about your secret life? Or am I a secret girlfriend?" She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "Does the invitation still stand?" "Shh! Eisley, what is going on? What do you mean, does the invitation still stand?" She walked in a circle, dripping water all over the foyer. "So, what's life like on Egret Ave?" He shrugged. "How would I know? That's over by your mother's cottage. I think if you go down Spoonbill, take a left on Piper, then 2 streets down past Skimmer. By the way, you ought to be proud of your mother, saving up and buying a place of her own," he said, referring to her comment when he'd stopped by to be sure they were ready for the storm. "Oh, yeah? And how about you? Do you have a live-in arrangement, or is this a temporary stopover? What do you do, Ford? Whisk into women's lives, sweep them off their feet, drive them around in convertibles, and then disappear?" Tears flooded her eyes. The thought of her being so upset was like a punch in the chest, but he didn't understand why. He wasn't sure what to say or do, but his silence seemed to fan the fire of her fury. "Where is she, Ford?" Eisley stalked toward the light coming from the living room. She repeated, "Does the invitation stand? Huh? I'm sure you'll love to hear about our little moment on the beach." She was shouting, hysterical. Before she woke Coco, Ford reached for her arm and spun her toward him. They stood there as though frozen in the eye of a storm. Their gazes met, and it was as though the wind sucked all the air from the room. Even upset, her lips were so perfectly kissable. He brushed the wet hair from her face. She seemed to lift onto her toes, but then thunder cracked and lightning lit up the room. Ford blinked a few times as Eisley dropped back with what almost sounded like a growl. He'd never seen her so angry and emotional. "Eisley." He was about to try to talk some sense into her when a loud cry echoed through the house. She blanched. Ford gave her arm a gentle squeeze, then hurried up the stairs to his daughter. A few minutes later he returned to find Eisley in the living room, staring at the baby monitor. He was relieved he was able to soothe Coco and that she'd fallen right back to sleep. "Why didn't you tell me?" Eisley's shoulders sagged, but the hint of a smile played on her lips. That was the end of chapter 10. We have 2 more to go, and I'm on a roll. I'm part of the One More Chapter Club, and we're going to keep going. I don't want to leave you on any cliffhangers, so I will save this, download it, put it on IGTV, and you come back and join me for chapter 11.